Hi friends, it can be difficult sometimes for us to checkmate an opponent even with overwhelming pieces. On the other hand, beginners often continue playing the game even if the game should have been a draw because of insufficient mating material rule. I have explained insufficient mating material rule in one of my previous videos. Rules for draw. Check the tag, friends. Here, I am going to explain the combination of pieces in which you can or cannot checkmate with when you're down to 2 or 3 pieces. First is our king and queen versus our opponent's lone king. Look at the setup here. The idea is cutting the squares and pushing the king to the corner. The queen will push the king and the white king will help in the checkmate. Now I locked the king in the 8th rank and I will bring my king closer now. Now this is a checkmate. I want to add one more point here. Suppose if the enemy king is in the corner and your queen is in a nice position to the enemy king, this will lock the enemy kings as possible squares and that will become a stalemate. So to avoid this, always give the enemy king at least 2 squares to move as it will avoid the stalemate. Second is our king and rook versus our opponent's lone king. The idea is more or less same like the queen, cutting the squares and pushing the king to the corner and then giving a checkmate with the help of the king. Next is a king and his 2 rooks versus the opponent's lone king. Look at the setup here. It is quite an easy win for white. It is the same effect even with a queen. But I will show you with 2 rooks. The idea here is cutting off the ranks and pushing the king to the corner of the board. Like rook to a6, king to f5, rook to h5, king to g4, rook to b5, king to f4, rook to a4, king to e3, rook to b3, king to d2, rook to e2, king to c1, rook to h3, king to b1, rook to g2, king to c1 and rook to h1, and that is a checkmate. Next is a king and his pawn versus the opponent's lone king. The idea here is promoting the pawn to queen and then giving a checkmate. But there are a few points you have to note. This pawn will be promoted in 3 moves. But can this king catch it? How do we calculate it? Well, I will teach you a technique called square rule. There are 3 squares here. Count 3 squares and make an imaginary square. Now if it is black's turn, it will step into our imaginary square and the pawn cannot be promoted. Suppose the king was here, even if it was black to move, he cannot step into our imaginary square and the pawn can be promoted. But if our king was near to the pawn, then we can simultaneously move both and the pawn can be promoted without the enemy king capturing it. Next is a king and his 2 two bishops versus the opponent's lone king. Look at the setup here. There are many ways to checkmate with two bishops, but I will show you a simpler way. The idea here is pushing the king beyond the 5th rank and bringing the bishops on the center of the board, thereby controlling 4 diagonals 1, 2, 3, 4 and limiting the king to 12 squares. Let us see how. Bishop to g2 check, king to e5, bishop to b2 check, king to f5, bishop to d4, king to e6, bishop to e4, king to e7, king to f2, king to e6, king to f3, king to d6, king to f4, king to e6, king to g5, king to e7, king to f5, king to d6, king to f6, king to d7, bishop to c5, king to d8. I moved my dark square bishop first to push the king behind. If I moved my light square bishop first, the king was already in d7 and it will come to d6 and attack my bishop. Bishop d5, king d7, king e5, king e8, king e6, king d8, bishop b6 check, king c8, bishop c6, king b8, king d6, king c8, king c5, king b8, king b5, king c8. Now I have limited the king to only 2 squares. King a6, king b8, bishop d7, king a8, bishop c5, king b8, bishop d6 check, king a8, bishop c6 checkmate. Next is king, bishop, knight versus the opponent's lone king. Look at the setup. The bishop and knight endgame is one of the most difficult endgames. Since the bishop is dark squared, we have to bring the enemy king to a1 or h8 to checkmate the enemy king. Black to play. King a4, king c5, king b3, knight b4, king b2, bishop f4, king c3, bishop e3, king b3, bishop d2, king a4, knight c2, king b3, knight d4 check, king a4, king b6, king a3, king a5, king b2, king a4, king a2, bishop c1, king b1, bishop a3, king a1, kb3, king b1, knight e2, king a1, bishop b2 check, king b1, knight c3 checkmate. So the 6 combinations we saw so far are checkmate possibilities. The next 4 are theoretically impossible checkmate combinations or draw by insufficient mating material rule. King bishop versus king, king knight versus king, king two knights versus king, and king versus king. I said that the king and his 2 knights versus the opponent's lone king is theoretically impossible to checkmate with. But if the opponent has an extra pawn, then there is a chance for the 2 knights to checkmate the enemy king. This is a long game and I will explain this in a separate video. Before I end the video, I have a brief slide for you. Check it out. Hope I've explained checkmate possibilities clearly. See you soon in my next video. Thank you.